Welcome back, everybody, to our next session. Queen G here with you. I'll just introduce this session and I'll let the host or the facilitator, Asha, introduce the rest of the panelists. This is Australia and the Asia Pacific with Asha Hirsch from Refugee Council of Australia. And he'll introduce the rest of the panel. So I'll hand it over to you and I'll be back with you at about 1:45 after our next break to introduce the closing panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Queen G, and thank you for everyone who's joining us this afternoon or wherever it is around the world where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining this important and hopefully insightful and informative session about the situation for refugees in our region, in the Asia Pacific region, and the role that Australia can and should be doing to improve refugee protection in the region. We're joined by three excellent panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. I'll give you a brief introduction or background to set the scene for why we believe this session is very important. So for many years, the Refugee Council has been involved in research and advocacy for improved protection of refugees in Asia Pacific, especially in regard to the constructive role Australia can and should be doing in our region. Improving refugee protection in Asia Pacific is not only about ensuring the human rights of refugees, it is also in Australia's national and strategic interest. If refugees are safe, have decent livelihoods and access to a durable solution, they are less likely to take further dangerous journeys to find safety. In much of the discussion about refugee protection in Australia, there is an assumption that resettlement is the only viable and durable solution to refugees in the Asia Pacific region. But because less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled in any year, most refugees have no real chance of being resettled. Many would in fact prefer to live in safety close to their country of origin, in the hope that they may be able to return one day. UNHCR speaks of three durable solutions for refugees: safe voluntary return to the country of origin when the threat of persecution has ended, integration into the country of asylum, including where possible permanency and citizenship, and resettlement to a third country. The goal of effective regional cooperation is to make sure all three durable solutions are much more widely available. By working where possible to seek change in countries of origin, encouraging greater opportunities for integration in countries of asylum, and working to expand global opportunities for refugee resettlement and the use of resettlement as a strategic goal as well. Since 2012, IPO has been advocating for an incremental process of change in the Asia Pacific region, which would begin with the most pressing needs of refugees and move gradually towards an agreed common regional strategy to protect refugees. However, if Australia is seen to be a leader, if Australia is to be seen to be a leader, it needs to seriously consider its own actions before attempting to persuade other countries to support refugees. We have damaged our international reputation to the point that we cannot talk in good faith about the need to improve refugee protection in the region. A few years ago, the Refugee Council put out a policy paper suggesting how Australia can play a more constructive role in the region and several countries can take to improve refugee protection. I will share it in the chat, but also return to these questions in the Q&A at the end. I'm just going to try and move my microphone in a second. Okay, hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now. I'm very sorry for that. For Australia and Australians to take effective action on refugee protection in our region, we must also be aware of the current challenges faced by refugees. Far too often we are unaware of the ongoing difficulties faced by refugees in our own backyard, especially as such news is often faded from the headlines. Few Australians will know about the situation in West Papua, or for refugees in Indonesia, or the ongoing political crisis in Myanmar and the effect that it has had on communities outside of that country. To give us some much needed perspective on this situation, we are joined by three experts who will give us an in-depth understanding of these issues. First up, we have Hafsar Tamessedin from the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, recently appointed chair of the APRRN network.
We have Jason Siwat from the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, and Halima Akhlaqi from the Cisarua Refugee Learning Center in Indonesia. Each of them will give us an update on the situation from Myanmar, West Papua, and Indonesia. So I'm going to invite each of them to give a presentation, and then followed by their individual presentation, I'll then invite any questions from the audience regarding the situation in that country. So please feel free to use the Q&A function as questions come to mind during their presentation, and they will be addressed at the end of their presentation. And then at the final end of all three presentations, we'll then also have a broader discussion and Q&A session as well. So first up, we have Hafsar. Hafsar is an advocate and human rights defender. She's been widely involved in the advocacy and activism for the rights of statelessness, refugee rights, prevention and responding to sexual and gender-based violence and LGBTI rights, both during her time as a refugee in Malaysia and currently in New Zealand. She worked very closely with Rohingya and refugees and other refugees from Myanmar, particularly in the prevention and response to sexual gender-based violence, including child marriage as a refugee woman protection call with the International Catholic Migration Committee for about 8 years during her time in Malaysia. She is still actively engaged in advocacy work for refugee rights, statelessness, LGBTQI rights, and prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence in New Zealand and other countries, whenever she has the opportunity to do so. She participated in the Global Refugee Forum as a refugee representative and a human rights defender with the Gender Audit Team and spoke at the post session. And as I mentioned, she has recently been appointed as chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. So congratulations on that appointment, Hafsar. We'll now hear from Hafsar. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me at this event through this platform to share a little bit about the update about Rohingya situation and ongoing coup of Myanmar. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also would like to acknowledge the resilience of refugees and forced migrants around the world and the hard work of the individuals and organizations that have been working in this sector to resolve the issues of refugees and forced migrants. Now, I'm not sure how much of may have been introduced by the moderator or facilitator, so I'm just gonna very briefly tell you guys about me. I was born as a stateless in my country as a Rohingya from Myanmar, and I was a former asylum seeker, former refugee, and a queer Muslim, and I'm now based in New Zealand. I got resettled to New Zealand 2.5 years ago. As of now, I am the chair of APRRN, and I'm also the member of advisory group for Forcibly Displaced People Network and steering committee member of APNO, and I'm also involved for different advocacy spaces for different humanitarian crises through different platforms. So if I have to speak about Rohingya refugees right now, as of the latest report by Catherine Wright on 25th March 2021, we now have about 880,000 refugees, Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. There are many organizations, individuals and humanitarian NGOs trying their best to provide adequate humanitarian assistance for these Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar. But unfortunately, it is the humanitarian assistance that Rohingya refugees are receiving right now is not adequate to have dignified human life. So they are quite vulnerable to different forms of exposure, such as natural disaster, exploitation, outbreak of pandemic. That includes infrastructure, So as of 25th of March 2021, there was a massive fire in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh camp that destroyed about 1,000 shelters, food distribution sites, and 15 people died, 560 injured, and 400 missing. And there are also some casualties in Bangladesh camp, Cox's Bazar, and different refugee camps. That includes human trafficking, child labor, child marriage, gender-based violence, and other forms of exploitation and abuse. Also, the other thing that really stood out for me and for many Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh camp is lack of formal education for the refugee kids in the refugee camps. It is quite overwhelming to see the entire younger generation who have experienced and witnessed inhumane oppression and torture in their life, now growing up without having any proper formal education. It's really concerning for all of us. And of course, we also have Rohingya refugees in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India, in diaspora in different countries. As you all might be already aware that the refugees from Malaysia, of course, they do not have the right to work, or they are not entitled for any legal protection. And as of the statistic in 2021, if we look at the resettlement for the refugees from Malaysia, it's only 2% of total refugees got resettled from Malaysia by 2018. And also the refugees from Malaysia are quite vulnerable to hate speech and xenophobia. The significant incidents for the Rohingya refugees, particularly in Malaysia, was in 2020 when there was pandemic happen, and the frustration and the anger of the local population is sort of shift to Rohingya refugees, and there was online campaign for hate speech against Rohingya refugees and xenophobia, but unfortunately there wasn't very firm, concrete action by the state government to halt such kind of hate speech and xenophobia against Rohingya refugees, to my knowledge. That is quite sad. And since I was in Malaysia like 10 years ago, there has been ongoing advocacy for the Rohingya refugees and for wider refugees to have work right in Malaysia, but it hasn't been still quite there yet. I mean, it hasn't been successful yet, but still through APRRRN and other advocacy platform network, the advocacy for the refugees to have the work right is still ongoing. And of course, in this kind of uncertainty where we have different lockdown and MOC for the entire population of Malaysia, it is really challenging and difficult for the Rohingya refugees, like other refugees, for their survival, to pay rent and food, etc. They are very vulnerable. And also refugees from Indonesia, they are also living in a very hopeless situation. There is no certain future for their education or better livelihood in where they are right now, or proper education. Even if they have they have access to the very basic primary education, to my knowledge, there isn't platform for the refugees from Indonesia or Malaysia or Bangladesh to access higher education, such as tertiary level of education. So if I speak for the ongoing coup in Myanmar that has started on the 1st of February 2021, so since the time the Myanmar military seized the power in a coup, as of last month report, we have 765 people have been killed by the state security forces in our country, Myanmar. 4,700 people have been arrested, including the country's democratically elected leaders. Hundreds have been shot in the street, and others are taken from their homes in nighttime raids, many turning up dead and bruises and broken bodies. More than 50 children have been killed, and that includes the youngest one, is 6 years old, shot in her home. There are also disturbing reports of torture and sexual abuse by the state forces. It is still ongoing as of now when I'm speaking to you guys. The internet has been blocked on and off and leaving most people without access to information at a time when they need it most. Scores of journalists have been arrested and media organizations are shuttered. Right now, the latest information that I received like last night, and now there is also restriction from the state government not allowing people to do food distribution and support to the people who are out there on the road to protest by any means. That includes medication and any type of support. So it is quite depressing and hopeless at the moment. So the opportunities, what I see right now for the Rohingya refugees or other refugees, wider communities, we often discuss about 3 solutions, excuse me, which is short-term solution and long-term solution. That includes, we're talking about how to make the lives of refugees where they are right now better. That means to make the lives of refugees in the host country or resettlement and repatriation. So as of New Zealand and Australia, I think we do have the capacity to bring more people to our countries. Both Australia and New Zealand have the capacity to resettle more refugees. And also, I am pretty sure that we have the capacity to involve more in depth in advocacy, whether it's encouraging the host countries to do better or to share the responsibility of the host country to make the lives of refugees better wherever they are right now. And in regard to repatriation, I see the role of New Zealand and Australia is again engaging with the government of the states and to make repatriation possible in a dignified way, where the people feel safe and secure to return to their homeland. So through what else we can do is right now the advocacy space is shifting. Now we have been really talking about the meaningful participation of refugees that includes empowering refugee-led organization, POC-led organization, and also making the participation of refugee possible and inclusive and accessible. So I also see the opportunities for the individuals and the organization to engage with the refugee-led organization or to engage with the organization that work for the refugees, whether through funding, resources, or if you have the capacity to do advocacy or maybe through advocacy platform to make some joint amplified strong advocacy or collaboration, again, among the individuals, the organizations, and also reaching out to the state if you do have the capacity through your advocacy platform or academia or whatever skills you have. So right now, the coup for Myanmar, it is very interesting and quite delicate matter. I'm not in the position to tell exactly what is the solution for now right now, for the coup of Myanmar right now, but what I can say is really from the space of UN and also from the space of ASEAN, going beyond writing statements about how sorry they are, making the bold move and actions against the military government of Myanmar, really stepping in forward about the coup in Myanmar and to support the civilians of Myanmar and the individuals and the actors that are really working hard to bring to create a government that is inclusive and fair to all the ethnic group of Myanmar. And for the individuals, again, it is just to support in whatever way you can. And also, of course, as of now, we have many people fleeing from Myanmar, from different states, such as Karen state, Kien state, and escaping from uncertainties and casualties from Myanmar. They are stuck in some IDP camps between Mesot, Thailand, and Myanmar. And even if they made it to the side of Thailand, because of the current situation and statement from the Thai government, UNHCR cannot do much, whether it's providing protection for the people who have escaped from Myanmar or any sort of action. So what people or individuals can do is really reaching out to the organization or the individuals that are really working at front at the ground level, supporting the individuals and family escaping from the coup and stuck in IDP camps and hiding in Thai-Myanmar border, they need a lot of support, whether it's medication, food, protection. So that is something, the very practical way of supporting the people who are escaping from Myanmar. And also because I am a stateless person, and I'm also belong to the LGBTQI communities as a queer person. I also would like to encourage the people to start engaging in the language that is inclusive for the statelessness and LGBTQI communities in the humanitarian work that we do. Because I haven't seen so far yet in every discussion about refugees or state or humanitarian issue, oftentimes the topic of LGBTQI communities and statelessness is not included in the language that we use or coming up in the framework of providing humanitarian assistance. So I really would like to encourage the people to start engaging in the language, in the dialogue, and also in the services that we think of to be inclusive of all the communities that we have. People with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, stateless people, young, adult, and women, men, because all this group are part of our society, and they are part of us. And that actually bring us back to the motto that we keep saying about leaving no one behind. I think I will end my presentation here, and if I will be joining the Zoom link today, and I'm very happy to take on any questions that the audience will have. And if people need to reach out to me, please get my email from Refugee Council of Australia. And thanks.
Thank you very much, Hafsar. So I understand also you're here with us live now. So if you have any questions for Hafsar, please put them in the Q&A. Perhaps I'll start with one practical general question. You talked about some of the emergency issues that refugees are facing who have fled Burma, and some of the needs that they have, medical needs, food, shelter. For those listening today in the conference, what are some very easy, practical ways that people can actually provide support? Is there key organizations that people should be donating to? Are there other ways that we can help? And what do you think is the best thing to do right now?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I have mentioned it in my presentation too, to help the people practically support with either with their food or protection or safety. It's really about looking at the capacity that the people have and the organization have. And also I strongly recommend it, and getting in touch with the people-led organization, refugee-led organization. There are some organizations such as Korean Women Organization working on the at Thai-Myanmar border, and also of course reaching out other organizations such as Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, which is a very good platform to network the people, organization, and individuals. And I would say really it doesn't matter what kind of support you can bring in, as long as you can put something. It can be resources, funding, or your voice as an advocate, or your strength of reading, writing pieces, report, and whatever way. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I might follow up with another question along those similar lines. I think one of the big themes that have emerged recently in recent years, and also in the conference over the last 2 days, is the importance and the strength of refugee-led organizations in responding to issues of displacement and crisis. So perhaps another question for you, Hafsar, is why you think refugee-led organizations are best placed to help address these issues. And what do they bring that makes them so important and powerful in these situations?
It will be the same thing that we keep repeating about the meaningful participation of the people affected. I think the people with experience are the best people who know what is best for them. And if we really care about delivering the culturally appropriate services, the services that are needed for the people and what is best for the people, whatever actions that we take, if we want to take it based on the best interest of the people, it is the best way and the best approach, which hasn't happened in the past, but it is happening right now. And I really look forward that kind of activities continue to happen and emerge into a meaningful participation of the people. And a lot of the works that we do are actually led by the people who are affected by a crisis and events.
Great, thank you very much. If we don't have any further questions, we can have further questions for Hafsar and the rest of the panelists at the end of the 3 presentations. So I'll move now to introduce Jason Siwat. Jason is a Director of Migrants and Refugees at the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. His previous role was as a RSC officer, that's a Refugee Status Determination Officer with PNG Immigration, a refugee caseworker, and an outreach officer with Caritas PNG, and has over 6 years of work in the refugee sector. So thank you very much for joining us, Jason. Jason's going to be talking to us about the situation for refugees in West Papua and Papua New Guinea as well.
Thank you very much, Asher. Thank you for this opportunity to speak at this conference. Good morning or good day to everyone. My name is Jason Siwat, as has been introduced briefly by Asher. I'm very privileged, and on behalf of our organization, extend our gratitude to Refugee Council of Australia to give us the invitation to present at this conference. Basically, I am not a refugee myself, but I've been working as a refugee status determination officer with one of the first group of officers to be PNG nationals to be trained as refugee status determination officer, and started working in the refugee sector in Papua New Guinea since 2014. My current role is with the Catholic Bishop Conference of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands as a director for migration and refugees, under which we support and provide other advocacy and other support to refugees and asylum seekers in Papua New Guinea. So, just to clarify, I will be not discussing on the issue of West Papua in West Papua, but from my understanding, that I will be discussing about the issue of West Papuan refugees who are in Papua New Guinea, and those that we particularly in contact with in Port Moresby. So basically in Papua New Guinea, there are 3 different groups of refugees amongst our community. The first and the biggest number population are those Melanesian refugees from West Papua region of Indonesia. The second group are the ones who have been transferred to Papua New Guinea from the Manus Island region, from Australia to the Manus Island Regional Processing Center under the arrangement between PNG and Australian government in 2013. And the final group, relatively small in number, are those who have arrived in Papua New Guinea spontaneously and are currently taken care of by the International Organization for Migration. So just to give a background of PNG involvement in the space of refugee protection and asylum seekers issues. So PNG became a member to the 1951 convention in 1986. But when it became a member, the government made reservations on the 7 key articles of the conventions. Since becoming a member, there wasn't any in-depth or any substantive action taken by the government to put into domestic legal frameworks relevant guidelines and laws that will enable the government to take care of refugees and asylum seekers as part of its obligation. So since around the same time in 1984 to 1986, PNG experienced a wave of refugees crossing border into Papua New Guinea from West Papua. When this group of people arrived, numbering between 10 to 11,000, they were basically given a permissive residency and allowed to settle along the borders. So up from that time up to around 2013, there was nothing like a refugee status determination procedure in place for the government. And nor was there any integration or settlement procedures and processes in place to enable these people to integrate into the local society. So most of them were undocumented, only for a good number who have been given the permanent residency. Those who have not been able to get those documents were more or less living undocumented. So they've been living in that type of situation up until 2013. With the onset of the regional resettlement arrangement between PNG and Australia in 2013, the government then made amendments to its Migration Act and the Migration Regulation, which then incorporate now the procedures for refugee determination. And also, that was when the attention came to Papua New Guinea about refugees and asylum seekers. Before then, there was not much media coverage or attention given to the conditions and situations surrounding the refugees from West Papua. So in 2013, with the legislation put in place and more greater involvement of UNHCR, the government sort of became responsive and trying to incorporate other domestic guidelines and legislations. In 2015, there was the refugee policy, which was introduced by the government to enable refugees to be resettled in Papua New Guinea. In that policy, it also covers the refugees from West Papua and other refugees who have been granted the status in Papua New Guinea. But it was also difficult for the government to implement the policy when there was the restriction on the 7 key articles. One of them include work rights, also housing and education, freedom of movement. So when the UNHCR recommended for the government to uplift the situations, it only did so for those who have been transferred to PNG from Australia and not any other cohorts of refugees. So basically, it means that people who have come to PNG spontaneously and the West Papuans were still restricted to gain work permit or work rights or supported by the government for housing, education, and the freedom to move around in the country. So these restrictions remain effective to date, though the government has not been very stringent on how it applies them. But the fact that the government has not uplifted it to cover everyone does not give a government direct or more sort of more obligation towards other refugees than to the Manus and Manus refugees who have been transferred to Manus Island. So the case of the West Papuan refugees in Port Moresby is one of is a protracted situation. In Port Moresby, where our office is, and we have direct involvement or interaction with a number of them, there is about 200 families scattered around Port Moresby. So these people are living on pieces of land which are basically not hygienic and not healthy for any human person to live or establish lives because of the lack of government direct involvement, this group of people have been basically relying on their own to survive. There is no direct government funding to help them, establish some sort of livelihood programs, assist the children to go to school, access a proper health care. So the basic situation is that they've been living on their own with whatever they could use to sustain themselves. One of the major challenges they have been facing all along is the insecurity of the settlement. The way where they are living is those pieces of land are owned by other parties. Since 2012, one of the major group of these people, West Papuans, have been evicted 5 times around Port Moresby. They've been evicted from the first place, and then they moved to settle somewhere, and they got evicted. So this is a very stressful situation for the West Papuans, especially in Port Moresby, where they are living, as well as in the border regions. Because of the lack of media coverage and advocacy, or the lack of assessment conducted to understand the situations, many stakeholders, including the government, does not really understand the extent of the needs these refugees have been faced with in terms of their welfare, their protection needs, housing, education, etc. that they need to integrate successfully into the local community. So the PNG at the moment, PNG immigration is still yet to incorporate maybe some more guidelines or some more procedures into the Migration Act to allow it to provide adequate support, especially from the part of the government, to enable these refugees from West Papua to integrate successfully. We still have issues. We still, from our interaction, we find out that they still have issues with accessing refugee documentation. So for those who have been given permissive residency, there was an exercise initiated by PNG Immigration in 2015, since 2015, to register all the West Papuans in PNG. A good number of them have been registered, but still most of them remain undocumented. The PNG Immigration also extended citizenship to those who have lived for more than 8 years in Papua New Guinea. I think about 140 around that mark have been given citizenship status. However, for those who have been given citizenship status, they still lack meaningful opportunities to get out of the previous situation they have been living as refugees. The only thing changed for them is the status, but nothing tangibly happened in terms of the programs or support from the government to ensure that they move on with their lives as any other human beings, to unlock their potentials, to enable them to do business or to engage in meaningful activities, to contribute effectively into the economy and also the social life of Papua New Guinea. In the Western province, where at the moment some thousands of them are living there, we still have contact with one of our Caritas coordinator who is working on because Catholic Bishop Conference is a Catholic organization. In Western province, we have a diocese there, which is the only sort of act as a non-government organization that directly deals with the issues faced by the West Papuans when they cross border. So that points to the fact that I want to raise, that in Papua New Guinea there is no sort of a government organization or registered civil society that is dedicated to working for the rights and advocating for the rights of refugees. That has not been the case, and it has been absent all along. The Catholic Bishop Conference only came into the scene with the the plight of Manus refugees, and also because of its involvement in the Western Province with West Papuan refugees. So that's where we try to come out to the public and take their responsibility and try to support them with advocacy and giving some, accessing some funds to support them where we can. So the fact that there is no government, there is no civil society dedicated to working with the refugees, it also limits the attention or the awareness of people about the plight of refugees in Papua New Guinea. In the government circle, I would say there is also a lack of visibility from the leaders about the ongoing situation of the West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea. And so there were no successful or productive advocacy among the government circle for policies and appropriate legislations or mechanisms to be put in place to support the integration of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea. So we have been trying to support them since 2018. We have initiated a small program that works to support especially the youths, because we have realized that given the inability of the parents to take care of themselves financially, and with the cost of living in Port Moresby, which is a huge struggle, most of the school-age children, as soon as they fall out of primary education, or they are finding it really difficult to enter into tertiary or college level education. And the unemployment and also illiteracy rate among the West Papuan refugees community and the children is also very high. So the program was initiated to support identified youths who have displayed willingness and, depending on our capacity, to support them to get short courses on trade skills. Since 2019, we have supported 34 of these young men and women who have been openly telling us that it was a life-changing opportunity for most of them who they didn't think that such opportunity would come to them if they have to continue, the situation remains the same. So we have assisted those number of youths to get short skills training with the aim that this would enable them to get employment, and in the future this would also give them the capability to increase their livelihood standards and contribute effectively towards, back to the community, the refugee community, especially the West Papuans. So I think what I can also raise is that though the media attention has been given to those who have been transferred from Australia to Manus, there is also this large group of refugees, the Melanesians from West Papua, living among us, who also deserves to get some attention, especially if we can advocate on about their situation, about their plight in whatever capacity we can, either to the government or any support that would be channeled to organizations who are directly involved with them to upskill or upgrade their living standard, especially targeting youths and school-age children, which we identified is a good way to intervene, so that in the next 5 or 6 years' time, we can at least change the situation from the status quo. And also, if any other way that would influence the government by, for example, sharing joint advocacy statements or any government to government or CSO to government intervention in terms of advocacy, that would influence the PNG government to take more appropriate and meaningful steps to put in place a refugee protection regime that will provide for these people in terms of integrating them successfully into the community, giving them, regularizing their status, and allowing them to move on in their lives. And this also for any other group of refugees who will be remaining in Papua New Guinea or will be arriving in Papua New Guinea in the future. So thank you. I would be happy to take some questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Jason. It's a very insightful information you provided, and I think you're absolutely right that, especially here in Australia, there's a lot more awareness and concern about the situation for refugees who've been transferred to PNG from Australia to Manus Island and now Port Moresby, but hardly any understanding or awareness about the situation for West Papuan refugees and the ongoing situation there. And I think it reflects a very Australian-centric type of understanding of the situation, where we're only concerned with refugees in PNG because of Australia's involvement. But I think you rightly pointed out that these are also important matters to consider and address, and the situation is quite dire as well for these people too. We have one question from the audience. So if anyone else has any other questions, please put them in the Q&A chat. But I'm going to start with my own question because I can. You've talked about the PNG government not doing very much for West Papuan refugees and not giving them rights under the Refugee Convention because of the reservations, and they only lifted those reservations for refugees who've been transferred by Australia. But I'm wondering, what is the PNG government's long-term plan for West Papuan refugees? Are they hoping that they will just eventually return home? Are they just trying to ignore the situation and keep them in destitution? Is there any discussion about what they hope to do in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Asha. I mean, the obvious position of the government with the treatment of West Papuans is, they just, as long as they give them the protection, or they allow them to come and live in the community, that's all that the government can do, as long as they are away from the source of persecution or whatever. There hasn't been any concrete consideration on how these people can be assisted in any other way to become independent, to integrate successfully. The government has also been have been relying on the systems, sort of the traditional systems in place with our Melanesians, sort of customs and how we relate to each other. Because the West Papuans are also Melanesians, and we are Melanesians on this side. Government was thinking as soon as they come in, they don't face any sort of difference in culture and language is a barrier, but culture and other ways of living is more or less the same as Papua New Guineans, and they could easily get along and live with the community. And slowly they tend to forget about them. So that is the sort of the position by the government. As long as they allow them and give them the okay to stay in Papua New Guinea, that's it. They can live and do whatever they can do to survive.
Yeah, that kind of answers the question from the audience here, but I'll also ask you to give a little more detail. The question is about what is the attitude of Papuans to those from West Papua, so towards the refugees from West Papua. How do they feel about them living in their community?
Yeah, look, generally there is no sort of that direct or extreme level of resentment that that would be visible in other parts of the country if you're from different ethnic group or sort of. In Papua New Guinea, generally they don't feel that, and part of it is because of the lack of awareness among the people. They don't see them as refugees. They just see them as other people who just come to live among them. So they don't see them with any sort of suspicion or any sort of privileges given to them or something like that. It's just like any other person moving from one part of the province, the country in Papua New Guinea, to live in other province in the country. So that is part of the reason why there is not much negative sort of attitude displayed, but much of the attitude of the people were welcoming. They give them some land to resettle on, which more or less make the government to be a little bit complacent in its effort to put in place some proper mechanisms on the part of the government. So the community in general has been very open, welcoming, and inviting for these people to live among them, as long as they can make their own gardens or do whatever they can, sell some things here and there to make ends meet.
Great, thank you. We have another question about so refugees who've been transferred by Australia to PNG and who have now married Papuan locals. Do you know about their situation and what is happening, and do they have rights to remain there? Are their children legally allowed to remain in Papua New Guinea? Are they allowed to freely mingle and live, or do you know anything else about what's happening for those people?
Yeah, very good question. So at the moment, from our statistics, there are about 12 of those men who are now married and established stable family, as far as we know, in Port Moresby. And a majority of them are refugees. Maybe three or two of them are non-refugees. But in terms of their status, especially for the children are, PNG citizens by birth. Most of the refugees are already allowed to move around freely. They are allowed to work. They can, and even some of them have started involving themselves with some business activities. There is also the question some of them are asking is how they can become citizens by marriage. So we have been trying to get information from the PNG government, and recently we have gotten some response saying that they are eligible for citizenship from the date they got married, if it's documented, the date from they got married until they are 8 years of residency in Papua New Guinea. It's not from the time they came into Papua New Guinea or the time they got their refugee status. It's from the time they are married. From the date they can be counted up to 8 years. And so generally they are free to move around. The non-refugees, although are not quite free, as we can all understand, but I would say that the PNG immigration or the PNG government has been quite lenient in allowing those people to, at least in Port Moresby, to move around and do a little bit of things here and there with their family. So there is a generally relaxed sort of approach by the government towards these people. And also the government is inviting them, if they wish to remain in Papua New Guinea, they are free, they will be given some recognition and support to remain in Papua New Guinea.
Thank you. I have another question about the political relationship between the PNG government and the Indonesian government. So if you know, and if you can answer this, what is the relationship like, the political relationship concerning Papuan refugees between the two countries?
Yeah, this is quite a sensitive, not really sensitive, but quite a tough one. From the government sphere, the government level, there has not been any public statement or anything that's supporting the move by the West Papuans for self-determination, or openly stating that the government of Indonesia should or condemning the situation in West Papua. What the government has been telling the people all along when people are raising these issues of atrocities in West Papua is that PNG and Indonesia share a very cordial sort of bilateral arrangement in terms of trade and other bilateral relationships. So at that level, the government is sort of not affected by the situation of West Papua when it comes to handling its bilateral affairs and relationship with the Indonesian government. It's only at the people level or organizations CSO levels that from time to time people raise issues and raise some concerns, public statement, even some activities on the street when it's to support the West Papuan movement for self-determination.
Thank you very much, Jason. That's all the time we have, but happy to also come back to some questions at the end for the whole panel. We're going to move to Halima now for an overview of the situation for refugees who are stranded in Indonesia. Halima is the manager for the Cisarua Refugee Learning Center, a refugee-run school in Indonesia. She is Hafsar from Afghanistan, but was born in Iran as a refugee after her parents left Afghanistan 43 years ago. She holds a BA in Language and Literature and worked as a volunteer teacher for 5 years in Mashhad, Iran, before traveling to Indonesia. She has been at the Cisarua Refugee Learning Center since December 2015, first as a teacher, then assistant manager, and then for the last 20 months as manager. Thank you very much, Halima.
Hello, my name is Halima Akhlaqi. It's a pleasure to be a part of this event. I'm a Hazara refugee from Afghanistan. I work as a volunteer educator at CRLC. CRLC is a learning center which was founded on August 2014 and run by refugees. Currently, there are around 280 students enrolled at CRLC. This number includes children under 18 who study school subjects. Moreover, there are literacy classes, English courses, computer classes, music, and GED classes for the adults. According to the latest statistics published by UNHCR, there are 13,916 refugees registered in Indonesia. More than half of this number are refugees from Afghanistan. The community that I will talk about are Afghan refugees who live in urban area independently. Almost there are similar life conditions for the other urban refugees who are from Somalia, Sudan, Myanmar, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. But obviously I cannot represent all of these groups. The points that I share in this video are collected after talking with 23 refugee friends and colleagues, and also there are some personal observations. To talk about the refugee condition, I have to start with the challenges. The difficulties of refugee lives are connected somehow to each other, but the most concerning one that almost every person talks about is financial issues. Since the refugees of Indonesia are not allowed to work, the ones who live out of camps or shelters, they must rely on the support of their relatives who live in Australia or they are left in home country. 4 years ago, when the resettlement process was going smoothly, there was a hope that we can return this debt to our relatives after getting resettled. But now the process is super slow, so neither the moneylender nor money taker know for how long we should go on this uncertain track. This caused that some of the refugees lost the support of their relatives. Some refugees are trying to make small businesses at home, but there is this fear that they might be arrested by the immigration. Recently, 7 refugees who had small grocery stores were arrested by the immigration. The other important challenge is healthcare. That obviously is divided in 2 branches, physical well-being and mental well-being. Accessibility to healthcare supports is not easy to get. There is a long process to get health support from UNHCR, CWS, CRS, or JRS. These organizations work with a close partnership with UNHCR. For example, if a patient wants to get support for the treatment, has to go to post-Christmas. Post-Christmas are public medical centers or government clinics. If the therapist staff of post-Christmas realize that this person needs to be under treatment of a specialist, then they give a reference letter. After getting that reference letter, a panel of CWS staff, they decide whether this patient needs the support or not. For the emergency cases that the person should be hospitalized immediately, the patients cannot wait for this paperwork. So they have to lend money from their relatives, their neighbors, their friends, or they have to accept the risk of not being hospitalized. There are some cases that lost their lives due to this irresponsible system. For example, a young refugee man who was only 22 years old and was suffering from tuberculosis. He wasn't recognized as an emergency case. He couldn't get the support for his treatment, and he passed away just a few weeks ago. For the emergency cases, if the person lends money, CWS will not refund the money back to the refugees. People will hear this easily, that your case is not life-threatening case. On the other hand, is the mental well-being of refugees. Definitely the people who fled their home country due to war, unsafety, or hunger, they are carrying traumas. Once we did a survey with the community connected to CRLC, and 73% of these people are survivors of torture, or one of their close family members are survivors of torture. Since 2014, 13 young refugees committed suicide. 6 of these suicides happened after the last July. This statistics shows how serious is mental well-being among the refugees. The same as getting physical health care, it's not easy to get mental health support. The refugees hear this response easily, that your case is not emergency. Stress, anxiety, difficulty in sleeping, losing tolerance, amnesia, and thoughts about suicide are common psychological concern among the refugees. Even though in CRLC we are trying to start a mental support project, and some good actions have been taken by volunteers in Jakarta, but what we can do here is so limited, and we cannot cover the needs of 14,000 refugees in Indonesia. As I mentioned before, the difficulties of refugee lives reach to one common root. The biggest challenge of refugee lives in Indonesia is the slow process of resettlement. The people here knows the solution of their problems in getting resettled, which makes them able to study, to work, to earn money, to get access to healthcare, to be able to forget the horrible experiments of the past and making a new life. UNHCR always claims that they can't do anything in this area unless the host countries increase the number of the refugees they take from Indonesia. They expresses that they are not able to affect on the policy of the hosting countries. That is true, but there is also a doubt among the refugees that UNHCR is not honest with us. As the number of resettled cases are so limited, only the case of a few refugees are ongoing. We don't know what is the criteria, and we don't know if really the vulnerable people get prioritized, or there is any other factor behind that. Having a clear system from UNHCR is what we expect. In Indonesia, there are many groups of refugees who still couldn't pass RST interview by UNHCR, so they are still known as asylum seekers, not refugees, after 5 years being in Indonesia. These people, they don't know if they will be able to get refugee status one day or not. Talking about the interaction with local community. Cisarua is a tourist area, so seeing foreign faces with a different language is something normal for the local people. They have been kind and welcoming for years, but recently the behavior of neighborhood people changed. I'm not sure what is the reason that the behavior of local people changed. Maybe it's because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they know the refugees responsible for the spread of virus or something else is as a reason. But what we expect from UNHCR is trying to make a peaceful relationship between the community, host community, and refugees. They can play an important role. The other expectation of refugee community is to access to an authority to refer to when they get into a trouble. Not being treated fairly by the police makes the refugees to prefer to not go to the police when they are in a conflict with local people. Even in robbery cases, the refugees prefer to be silent and not follow up the issue. A considerable group of refugees are single people and also separated families. Single men and women, they are not recognized as emergency cases by the UNHCR, even for getting healthcare services or for getting financial assistance, they are not in top priority. Among this group, there are men who are married, but their wife and children are left in Afghanistan, in the home country. In the group of single men, there are many who haven't heard anything from UNHCR since 2010. The twofold policy from the UNHCR has created a distance between singles and families. This is a harming effect of this policy, as singles do not feel themselves as a part of the community, and it deprives the single of having the social support of the people of their own. Besides, there is a numerous group of single moms who live in Indonesia with their children, but their husbands are in Australia. Due to the Australian law of July 2014, they are not able to integrate. This group are hoping that this law will be changed one day in near future. The role of UNHCR. Since I'm in Indonesia, UNHCR has a limited and insufficient interaction with the refugees. Since 2014, they only visited Cisarua 2 times, while during their absence, the refugee community, they made learning centers and they supported each other. During these years, UNHCR only tried to be in contact with the managers of learning centers and refugee representatives by messaging in WhatsApp. We believe that UNHCR can play a better role to establish a good communication with the refugees, to make a better platform, to speak with the people, to speak with the refugees and make a connection between refugees and UNHCR and responsible organizations. Counseling system of UNHCR. Before the refugees were able to get an appointment and visit with the UNHCR officers and talking, sharing their issues, their problems with the UNHCR, but just a few weeks before the outbreak of COVID-19, this system has changed. They made an online form. Each person must fill that and write down their problems, but this online system is not working well. The messages and emails to UNHCR will be left without reply. In some cases, UNHCR refers people to ask help from their representatives or refugee association, which is led by refugees. Refugee representatives are elected yearly among the refugee candidates. This kind of responding to refugees by UNHCR makes the refugees to lose their trust to representatives. There is a common thought between the people that representatives are paid by UNHCR to keep refugees away from the UNHCR. Responsibility of the international communities. Resettling countries, including Australia and the US, must take more refugees from Indonesia. As I mentioned before, more than half of refugees in Indonesia are from Afghanistan. The recent withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan made our lives in more danger. International communities are leaving Afghanistan while Taliban are more powerful than the past, and their ideology hasn't changed yet. As signatory of Geneva Convention, the resettling countries, including Australia, they should fulfill their obligations toward refugees and protect us. To conclude, I must say, even though the number of refugees in Indonesia is not as high as the other countries, but this doesn't mean that the refugees of Indonesia are not vulnerable. Instead, years of being in limbo in Indonesia made the refugee lives here harder than before. Difficulty in financial things, lack of access to livelihood opportunities, lack of access to healthcare services, increasing the number of suicides and mental patients. These all talk about the refugee lives. During these years, we have been supporting each other since 2013. We created communities, we made learning centers, sport clubs, associations for refugees, handicraft classes, all of these. But we appreciate and welcome UNHCR to join us. We advocate this for years for UNHCR, but we request them to come forward and help us to improve the refugee lives. We ask Australian to rethink about the refugee policies. We believe that democratic values care about the life of refugees. Thank you so much. Hello, my name is
Thank you very much, Halima. A very clear and powerful message there, and a great overview of the situation. And again, some really difficult situation that people are facing in Indonesia. So thank you very much for sharing. We also have Halima join us via Zoom today as well to answer your questions. Halima, you touched on at the end the role that your organization, Cisarua Refugee Learning Center, plays as a refugee-led organization. And I would encourage everyone on the conference today to check out The Staging Post, a great film about how that school and organization was established. And it goes into also the lives of refugees in Indonesia there. So anyone who hasn't seen it, The Staging Post is very worthwhile watching, and you can find it online. I want to ask you, Halima, I think Cisarua Refugee Learning Center is one of many refugee-led organizations in Indonesia and doing some remarkable work. Can you tell me about how you see the role of refugee-led organizations and the importance of them, and why it's important that refugee communities are at the center and the front of these issues? But also you touched on the dynamics there between refugee-led organizations and international organizations like UNHCR or other NGOs. How do you see that role playing out when there was very little support from NGOs and other organizations in Indonesia for refugees?
Hello again to everyone. Since 2014 that CRLC, Cisarua Refugee Learning Center, established, 8 other refugee-led initiatives started their work in Cisarua. These refugee initiatives includes schools, sport clubs, and also handicraft centers that they have some kind of trainings for making products and helping the refugees to gain some skills. During these years, having refugee centers made the community to be supporting each other and helping each other to bear the situation. Even when the COVID-19 hit Indonesia, and we faced with a new challenge. The learning centers and also refugee organizations, they try to support each other, and we didn't wait for UNHCR or other organizations who are friends with UNHCR to help us. We quickly provided some hygienic kits for the community, and we try to be in contact regularly with the people to provide them awareness about how they can care of each other and how they can be protected during the COVID-19. I remember when the process of resettlement started to get slow and slower 5 years ago. UNHCR came just one time to Cisarua and encouraged the refugees to be involved with their schools and to study and to learn and be connected with each other. But of course, there are other aspects of refugee lives, not only education that people need, like I mentioned, livelihood, access to health, access to a good financial resource. There are the needs of refugees that refugee centers cannot support all of them. Only it's a limited support that we can provide for each other. But at least in Cisarua, we didn't wait for UNHCR.
Thank you. I think that highlights the important role that refugee-led organizations play in addressing these situations, and they know what to do. But of course, the whole problem is resourcing there, and yeah, all of your organizations are mostly refugee-run and very, very little resources. So again, people want something practical they can do for refugees. I think it is to look at refugee-led organizations in the region and see how they can support them. I'm going to move on to broader questions about the role that Australia has in this region because of time. I think we were talking about the situation here, but not too far in the background, it is really Australia's role in somewhat creating or further exacerbating the situation behind the scenes. We see that a lot, especially in Indonesia. Halima, you touched on some of Australia's policies in a resettlement ban for anyone after 2014. And obviously our turn back the boat policies have also had a massive impact on refugees there. Jason talked about the role that Australia played in Papua New Guinea as well. And obviously Australia has a broader role to play also in the region in regards to Myanmar as well. But I guess the first question is, it's about Australia's reputation. And if Australia is going to do anything in the region, we first have to improve our connection and reputation in the region. So my question for all three of you is, what do people in the region, either refugees or NGOs or other citizens of the country, what do they think about Australia and its role and what it's doing in regards to refugee protection? And how does that impact what Australia can do to be a positive impact in the region? Hafsar, maybe I'll go with you first, if you want.
I think what is the people impression on Australia role is, I think I have mentioned it before, and I honestly believe that Australia has more capacity than what has been done as a country in regard to the regional refugee context, whether it comes to resettlement or when it comes to engaging in the repatriation process for the refugees, or whether sharing the responsibility of the host country, or whether engaging in advocacy in making the lives of refugees in host countries better. So I think Australia has many more capacity to do better. And I hope after this conference and people will or individuals or organizations will be engaging to look at a way, how do we share our resources? How do we share our expertise? How do we share our advocacy platform? How do we share the power and the position that we hold to address the regional refugee context, going under the themes of making the livelihood of refugees better in host country, looking and exploring options for the better resettlement and increasing the number of resettlement, and finally, looking at the dignified and safe repatriation for the refugees. And I'll pass it to Halima or Jason. Thanks.
Jason, do you have any thoughts about Australia's reputation? What do people in PNG think about Australia and what it's doing in terms of its refugee policies?
Thanks, Hafsar. And so, again, I will this is because of the involvement of organizations and people in such discussion is quite limited. What I'm sharing is generally those people or organizations who are active in discussing this issue. So the general perception is that Australia, not Australia, not meaning the people in general, but the government of Australia is sort of offloading its responsibility to Papua New Guinea, and which is also at a cost. Many people that I've spoken to have heard them speaking about this issue, saying that when these refugees have been transferred from Australia under this arrangement to Papua New Guinea, as a way of portraying a deterrence from Australia's perspective to discourage boats going into Australia, which works in favor of Australia, but on the other extreme, it shows PNG as a country that is not maybe suitable for people to come and live in, impoverished. As also, media also mentioned that a couple of times in a number of articles about this. We see as asylum seekers transferred to an impoverished Pacific Island nation. So this is something that many people in Papua New Guinea doesn't feel good about. Showing to the world what Papua New Guinea is like, but in fact, this is not the case. People still survive in Papua New Guinea. Those who have been living here for 8 years, they have been supported by the local community. But generally speaking, the government of Australia is some people are saying that it's using its status or take advantage of its position as to influence the government to accept the deal with some incentives. So which also says something about they say Australia still has a huge landmass. It's a developed country. It has well established institutions to take care of refugees. It has good refugee protection regime that can take care of almost every refugee from any other country. Why does it consider to send them to Papua New Guinea when it knows knowingly that Papua New Guinea doesn't have an adequate legal protection regime for refugees and these kind of things? Within these existing challenges, they decide to send people to Papua New Guinea. So there is a general sort of ill feeling about those who think that Australia is just basically offloading its responsibility to a country like Papua New Guinea to take care of it.
Thank you, Jason. If only Australia would use its power and influence for refugee protection rather than deterrence. If you imagine all the money that we've spent on deterrence and the influence that we've spent on this policy, could be used for good instead. Halima, what do refugees in Indonesia think about Australia and the current policies?
In our small community, I see that the people, we usually are in contact with Australian friends who come to Cisarua and visit the learning centers. I mean, mostly before the COVID-19, but it happens yearly that people come and visit us. And the try of all of us is to show a positive face of refugees, that they are not going to be a burden for the resettling countries. We can we can contribute to the new society, and yeah, this is the hope of refugees in Indonesia. As I mentioned, many of the refugees here are separated families. Since the refugees who came to Indonesia, they were hoping to be resettled in Australia. Many of the separated families, the men of the families are in Australia, but they cannot be integrated due to the laws. So changing in the policies will survive the life of many people in Indonesia.
Thank you. I'm concerned that we're almost out of time, so we might have to wrap up. We didn't get enough time to talk about what are some positive things that Australia could be doing. I will put a link to our policy paper from a few years ago that talks about some of the role that Australia can play in Asia Pacific. But I think the first point that we need to make is that Australia is really undermining its own efforts here and undermining its reputation by continuing its harsh and deterrence policies, which in the long run will only go against its national interests as well as the interests of refugees in the region. So I want to thank you very much, Jason, Halima, and Hafsar, for your very insightful and helpful presentations in getting a better understanding of the situation in the region. So thank you very much for your time. I also encourage everyone to please complete a survey, which is in your chat for the session, again, to win a cookbook. And we've also posted a link to the Staging Post movie as well, for those who want to see a really great refugee-led organization in action. So we'll be joining back in the plenary session at 2:45. So we have a 15-minute coffee break, and we'll see you all back there shortly. Thank you very much for joining us, and please keep in touch if you have any further questions.